This week on Filthy Hope.
Yeah, look, the whole crowd thing is really interesting, and you see crowds responding in sport and, you know, in the sort of political rallies that we see, particularly without igniting too many fires. When you see reporting of a Trump rally, and then there's been attempts in Australia by conservative politicians to kind of drum up a Trump-style rally, and culturally it just doesn't quite work in Australia for some reason.
Yeah,
for which I think we can be quite thankful.
Yes, definitely. This episode of Filthy Hope was produced with the support of our Patreon members. If you want to support us here at Filthy Hope Studios financially, the best and easiest way to do that is to head over to patreon.com/filthyhope and become a patron. For just the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you get access to every episode a day early, totally ad-free, and a bonus 20-minute segment of Filthy Hope exclusive to Patreon members. You'll also get early access to things like merch and tickets for our live events. So once again, that is patreon.com/filthyhope to become a Patreon member. Hello and welcome back to Filthy Hope. If it's your first time here on this podcast, we spend time in the grey spaces where Jesus, life and culture intersect. And joining me again on the podcast, he's back.
He's back.
Dave
He's not
Cornford.
the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy.
That's right. So today, in wrapping up our 4-episode Easter series, we're going to be talking about a few things, but in particular, another film that covers really the whole life of, we'll get into it. Does it cover the life of Jesus?
Yeah.
But particularly touches on some of the imagery and themes of the passion narrative, which is Monty Python's Life of Brian, which actually, people that are only listening, we're filming this in front of my movie collection. I've got it right here. This movie right here.
And also for the watchers, a very dog-eared copy of the script.
Yes. So maybe first, when did you get the script, and what is there a story behind how you got your hands on it?
Oh, look, it would have been around at the time. The film came out in 79 or 78?
79.
79. Yeah. That was year 11 for me, kind of peak comedy time. And I would have seen the film. There was this little hole in the wall cinema about the same size as Golden Age cinema, like 50, 60 seats, downstairs in Perth, that ran the film like as a cult classic for $5 tickets or something for ages. So I would have seen it, I think, 10 times there.
Yeah.
Over 3 or 4 years. It just kept running and running and running. So I'd have picked the script would have been around then. 40-something years ago.
So suffice to say, you're very familiar with this movie.
Embarrassingly so, yes.
Yeah. I think it's one of those ones that, because you've had there's a box set that you've got at home. I'm assuming you've probably still got it with their 3 films, or their 4 films, the 3 featured narrative films and the Live at the Hollywood Bowl.
Yeah.
And it was the one that I probably couldn't watch for the longest, just in terms of probably its rudeness.
Yes.
So I've probably seen this since about the age of 15, probably 10 or 12 times as well. I probably watch it about once a year. And I'm just now actually thinking, I won't say her name because she doesn't like being mentioned on the podcast, but I don't think my partner has actually seen this one.
Right.
We do when we do movie night, we go back and forth who gets to pick, and the whole deal is whatever the other person picks,
you have to watch.
Yep. So she's definitely seen. I made her watch the Holy Grail.
Yep.
Didn't find it funny.
Oh dear.
So I've put that back on my mental list of things to show her.
Yeah, and I would. Life of Brian is a step up from Holy Grail. Look, the Holy Grail's funny, just the writing in Life
Yeah.
of Brian is just even
Fantastic.
better than Holy Grail. I think that's the best way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think from just really briefly on a filmmaking point of view, the Holy Grail has a really nice, rugged feeling to it.
Yep.
Like it feels like a bunch of people just going out and making a movie against the odds.
Yes.
Which it was,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
And Life of Brian, again, feels like a big step up.
Yeah.
I imagine, I don't know this for fact, but I imagine after the success of the Holy Grail, they probably had more resources at their disposal. And
It was filmed in Africa, I think. Was it filmed in? Or am I thinking of Star Wars
Possibly.
filmed in Tunisia? It's probably the same place.
possibly, yeah. And around the same time, Star Wars 77, this was 79.
Yeah, a bit after. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just think, yeah, it's everything that's good about the Holy Grail is present in the Life of Brian, but it's elevated.
Better, yeah.
But yeah. So if people haven't seen it, that's fine. You will still understand this conversation.
And it's funny because I'm mentoring someone in ministry, and we had a phone call today and talking about what I was doing today.
Yep.
And he hasn't seen the film
There you
either.
go.
So
There you go.
it's no big deal, but it's just it's just funny that on the day that we're talking about it, I happened to have a conversation with someone who hadn't seen it.
Yeah. So before we dive in, because there's lots of stuff to unpack in and around this movie, we last week were talking a little bit about Lent, and I spoke a little bit about how. So a listener actually asked, "What do you guys do for Lent, if anything, and how do you feel about particularly the practice of fasting or giving things up?" And I spoke a little bit about, just for anyone that may not have heard that episode last week, I found the whole Lent practice, for me personally, became a bit performative, and every year it came around to Pancake Tuesday, and I suddenly went, got to give something up. What's it going to get? What's going to be? And is it coffee? Is it sugar? Is it blah, 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 blah? And then it was more about like, so what are you giving up this year, as opposed to any genuine fasting practice? So maybe I'd be curious to hear from you. How have you engaged with that particular practice in Lent in the past, and what does that look like for you today?
Maybe a couple of times, but generally no. And I guess referring back to the 2 episodes ago,
Might be 3
episodes ago, that I was on, that Lent was a time of crazy activity for a higher purpose, like for a good thing to be doing. And so what was I giving up? Time to myself and whatever else.
I think you said off camera, sanity
and sleep. And I guess at one of the kind of cycles of Lent at church, we talked about what we were putting on at Lent, putting on kindness, putting on, like not as a counter to fasting, but and I find that a helpful thing to reflect on, of how to be a better disciple in Lent. So I think that's kind of where my head is, and I think the practice of fasting is the same objective, because it's about making space for prayer and reflection or whatever.
That's certainly, I think, what we, in reflecting last week, Ness and I were talking about the additive process of Lent being a really positive thing, and making room for things that you can actually add to your.
It's so interesting, isn't it, that the method, fasting to create space, can so easily take over from the purpose, which is space for prayer and reflection.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a self-denial thing. It's not to be kind of downplayed particularly, but the practice can easily be a bit disconnected from the purpose.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what I had found. I think as a youth group kid, we were encouraged by our leaders to think about, this Lent, are you going to give something up? And the classic was always if you give up a cup of coffee, that money that you would spend on a cup of coffee you can think about. And there were usually a couple of organisations that were provided as you could give that money to do this. But I think it just turned into, for me, and this isn't a reflection on the practice itself, but just in the culture that I found myself in and around Lent and fasting, was who's going to give up the craziest thing.
Yes.
Which just became totally not the point.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So, again, James, thank you for the question. You got a double answer across 2 weeks. You got some bang for your buck. So thank you for the question. And again, if people do want to contribute questions, thoughts that we will address on the show, find us on social media or filthyhopepod@gmail.com, or down below there is also a link to our Facebook group, which is where those questions from James came from. So we'd love for you to contribute more to this show if that's something that you want to do. So let's talk about this movie. And I guess the first question that I find coming to mind is this a movie about Jesus? And the simple answer is no, but the longer and more complex answer
is kind of
what I think the topic of today's conversation.
And it's almost interesting if we go back to the conversation of Jesus of Montreal, where we've kind of got these, we talked about the two streams of the play they were putting on and the life of the actors.
Yeah.
In Life of Brian, the film very clearly at the start, in an absolutely amazingly funny scene, has the three wise men come and give the gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh to Brian's mum, and then come back 5 minutes later and take them off her and go off, and you can see the stable with the star above it and the glowing light to take the gifts to Jesus. So in one sense, and in a couple of other scenes in the film, it's clearly from a plain first reading narrative point of view, running this story about this poor guy called Brian at the time of Jesus. And the life of Jesus is affirmed in a sense because we see a couple of points where the stories
overlap.
Kind of overlap. But then there's all this stuff that's happening to this poor guy called Brian, which is really a parody of a bunch of stuff. There's parodies about miracles, about followers, about the life of Brian's mum.
Crowd mentality.
The Romans.
I remember I used a clip from this movie in a year 10 history assessment about the Romans. About Rome.
And those things are, well, they're poking fun. Are they poking fun at other history movies? They're poking fun at crowds. They're poking fun at miracles. Are they poking fun about religious prophets in the Near East in the ancient world? It's doing all of that as well. So it's cleverly treading a fine line, and it'd be interesting. They were obviously defensive about the movie when they were attacked about it, but interesting to actually go under the cover about how they thought about. Are we just putting the bit about Jesus in the film to cover us?
Yeah,
and
as a
I actually think
card.
I would be surprised because I think it's part of a very sophisticated.
I think they're too smart for that.
Writing this very sophisticated piece of comedy. That I don't think it was just a defence. It doesn't feel like a defence mechanism, even though perhaps they were pleased to be able to draw on it when people were carrying on at them about it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll put a link to this down below. There's also a very famous TV debate that kind of gets at a lot of this controversy, I guess is the right word for it, around the movie between John Cleese and it's Michael Palin, isn't it? The other one?
So, yeah. I haven't seen it for a while.
From Python, and two members of Catholic clergy, a live TV debate around the film. And that is the two Cleese and Palin come back to, no, in the very beginning of the movie, we do establish this is not a movie about Jesus. Jesus is a character in the movie, and we don't
question what happened to him.
Exactly. But I think you're right in that it is to simply say that that's their one pressure valve, their one get out of jail free card, I think is actually underplaying how sophisticated and smart not only this script and this film is, but them as writers and comedians. I think there's much more of it going on than we're just going to make fun of Jesus, but put this little bit at the beginning that says, oh, but when it's not actually about Jesus.
Yeah. So we don't, in case someone wants to ban us.
Exactly. Exactly. So I guess maybe as a Christian and as a huge fan of this movie, how do you kind of navigate some of the more what other Christians might point to as blasphemous, offensive? How do you kind of hold the tension of that? Is that an issue, or is it just comedy?
Yeah, look, I in some ways I want to go, oh, well, look, it's just comedy. But, as we just go back to what we said a minute ago, it's a bit hard to do that. And perhaps taking a step back, as a or perhaps put it this way, do you imagine that anyone who's not a disciple of Jesus was drawn closer to doing that through watching the film? And I don't know, but I'd struggle to say to point at stuff in the film that would lead for that to happen.
For people to watch the film and be drawn closer. Yep.
Now, that's an interesting question. I can't see it.
And also almost the flip of that is the opposite true in any case. Is would a non-follower see this film and anything push them further away? I also don't know if that is true.
Well, and again, maybe it would, for some people, it would just go, that whole thing about Jesus is just silly, right? You've got the scene at the back of the crowd for the Sermon on the Mount talking about blessed. Speak up. Blessed are the cheesemakers. Oh, that's not cheesemakers.
Of dairy products,
right?
Yeah.
Amazing writing.
Yeah.
But those jokes. Does that make people go, oh, blessed are the peacemakers? What's Jesus on about? I think that the chance of that just affirming that for a non-disciple's point of view, just means, it's silly.
Yeah.
It's worthy of being poked fun at. And so,
because in that, like a gag like that isn't making fun of Jesus or the words that he's saying.
No.
It's a situational gag that's just silly.
Yes.
And I remember hearing one of them talk, I can't remember where, about that particular gag, but then also kind of the movie in general came out of, I think it was while they were filming Holy Grail, one of them had an idea for a sketch about one of the disciples of Jesus who was going to write a gospel but was always late and always missed the big events and always turned up and so that's one of the kernels of that idea, which isn't making fun of Jesus. It's just a bit silly and kind of funny.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like the idea of one of the disciples always turning up late, so they weren't able to write the fifth gospel.
Yes,
it's just kind of funny.
Yeah, yes, and then again from a comedic or understanding the development of comedy, so knowing that and going, and that morphed into this other gag, which isn't about that at all, but it's about people not being able to hear, and then, what's the right word? The kind of pompous guy pronouncing that it's about all purveyors of dairy products is kind of, what does taking what's being said and interpreting it mean?
Yeah.
And from a negative point of view, is that just saying that people are taking a lend of what they've heard from Jesus and turned it into? While not directly pushing back about the actual Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, yeah. Because when it comes down to it, like I think you said earlier, any and all portrayals of Jesus are very straight down the middle.
Yeah.
Jesus isn't shouting, "Blessed are the cheesemakers." Jesus is portrayed very straight down the middle.
Yeah,
He's just delivering the Sermon on the Mount, and the same with the stable at the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
This episode of Filthy Hope is brought to you in partnership with the new podcast from Filthy Hope Studios, Into the Word. Rev Ness and Pastor Jonty, your hosts here on Filthy Hope, will be hosting short, sharp conversations around a piece of scripture, helping you on your daily journey to dive deeper into the Word of God. This new show will be launching on Wednesday, the 3rd of April, and will have its own podcast feed separate from this feed here on Filthy Hope, although we will also be publishing the first handful of episodes here on this feed as well. If you're watching us on YouTube, then Into the Word will be coming to you right here on Filthy Hope Studios. So we invite you to tune in with us from April the 3rd as we bring you weekly bite-sized doses of Bible, helping you on your journey into the Word. Yeah, I think that's lodged something loose out of my brain in that I wonder if this is more about followers of Jesus than anything else, this movie, and critiquing some of the behaviour that I'm sure the Python boys were encountering, particularly like at universities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it was obviously of a time, and I'm just coming to the end of Cleese's autobiography, and like I'm very near the end, and Monty Python hasn't even formed yet,
right?
And so I don't know if there's a second volume or if he's going to write a second volume, and I guess he's writing to talk about what formed him as a writer, and lots of stuff that I just didn't know about British comedy in the 60s, which led up to the Python period from the late 60s into the 70s through to this film and the next one. A very interesting character, and obviously he's presenting his own version of that. Yeah. Look, the whole crowd thing is really interesting, and you see crowds responding in sport and in the sort of political rallies that we see, particularly without igniting too many fires. When you see reporting of a Trump rally. And then there's been attempts in Australia by conservative politicians to kind of drum up a Trump-style rally, and culturally it just doesn't quite work in Australia for some reason. Yeah, for which I think we can be quite thankful.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
I mean, in the film there's the classic scene where there's the crowd assembled outside the bedroom window, and Brian kind of opens the window in a state of undress, and everyone's there kind of waiting for Brian's word, and Brian doesn't want to tell them anything. He tells them to
get stuff,
go away. Yeah. The crowd is just so willing. Willing to be misled, or willing to hear something from someone else, or I think there's some really uncomfortable questions about the crowd, and how they were getting together and creating this myth about Brian, who, unlike the Jesus we read of in the Gospels, Brian's not saying anything wise or challenging the teachers or doing anything like that. He's just found himself in this in this situation.
The crowd have already decided, is the way I read it.
Yes.
Like, whether or not it's true, and clearly in the case of Brian, it's not.
Yeah. They've
already decided this is the guy. And so that's why they're all there waiting and hanging on his every word and manipulating everything he says into, that's must also be a sign of him being the Messiah. And
and again, from a point of view of critique from a Christian point of view, that is a thing that's kind of, not saying that's what the crowds who listened to Jesus were like, but, it's kind of asking that question, was the movement that Jesus started created by the crowd rather than brought into being from his ministry, from his wisdom, from his teaching, from him discipling the members of the crowd, from the core group living differently that people saw and wanted to join in.
It reminds me, a couple of weeks ago in our Last Temptation of Christ conversation, have you seen The Last Temptation of Christ?
I've seen the film, but a long time ago.
Yeah. So during the long sequence at the end when Jesus is imagining his life, if he doesn't fulfill his
destiny,
saves himself and gets down and grows old with a family, he has this pivotal conversation with Peter as Jesus is an old man, where Peter's telling him about the revolution, the movement, about the risen Christ, and Jesus says, no, you got it wrong. I'm Jesus. I didn't die. And his response is, doesn't matter. Even if you are Jesus and what you're telling me is true, it doesn't matter whether or not what you're telling me is true, because the movement has already begun. The crowd has already joined. The word has already started spreading, and the gospel has ignited and is spreading. Which, from the perspective of the author, who's a very controversial Greek Orthodox writer, I wonder what the intent is with that, if it's questioning whether or not the risen Christ is the reality and a core doctrine. But regardless, it's that thing of crowds will are vulnerable to being manipulated into driving movements.
Well, let's,
it's very complicated.
Right. As a crowd in America, I mean, I've seen a few interviews with people, and they were both older women who were standing by the highway with Trump banners while he was, something was going on. And they were just asked, what's good about Trump? And they said, he's just one of us. He started at the bottom and worked his way up, and he understands us. And that's just
it's just not true.
It was born with a silver spoon in his mouth.
Yeah,
probably if he'd put his dad's money in the bank, he'd probably have more than he's got now. He's just a charlatan, and it would be far more comforting for those women to say, "Oh, look, Donald's not perfect, but he's changing the country for the better," because that would be more honest than somehow them believing
that he represented
them or understood them in any way, which he's not that.
No, I have so many more thoughts on, but this is not a conversation about Trump.
Let's not go there.
I think another interesting parallel is about this is people might have seen Dune Part 2 released when this comes out. It will have been out for a while. And the core idea of Dune, the novel, and these film adaptations is this idea of Messiah and what happens when a group of people are galvanized and united around a Messiah figure. And there's all this stuff about, for people that know Dune, the prophecy, which has many different names in different cultures within the Dune universe, is actually a manufactured one from a group of people who have been working behind the scenes for thousands and thousands and thousands of years through genetic manipulation, but also planting stories in cultures over thousands and thousands of years, are trying to essentially engineer a Messiah so that they can build their own political leader that they can essentially claim power through. And the reason I bring this up, obviously because there's a parallel between Life of Brian and Dune, funnily enough, But there's actually...
I bet you won't hear that discussed on any podcast.
But there's actually a moment in the film, Dune Part 2, that just came out that I think is a deliberate and really obvious reference to Life of Brian. And I was watching... I saw this movie twice when it came out, once in IMAX and once on 70mm, because I'm a nerd. And the second time I saw this was with my friend Matt. G'day if you're listening. And we both leaned across to each other and said, did you think there'd be a Life of Brian reference in the first 20 minutes of this movie? And it happens because there's a very, very similar scene in which the group that Paul finds himself in, amongst the Fremen, the natives on Arrakis, think that there's a group that start to think that he might be the Messiah. And he's trying his best to play it down, because he hasn't reached the point at which he's discovered that if he leans into this Messiah thing, he can use that for his political benefit. At this point, he's still going, no, chill. I'm just a guy. And then it hard cuts to Javier Bardem's character, whose name's Stilgar, talking to other Fremen going, only the Messiah would be so humble as to claim that he wasn't the Messiah. It's a sign. He's the Messiah, which is almost word for word
from Life of Brian.
Life of Brian. And I'm sitting there watching this giant science fiction epic adaptation of a unfilmable novel from the 1960s going, how is Life of Brian making its way into this? But it's that same thing of like, not just crowds, but also I think individuals have the ability or the potential to come to this discussion having already made up their mind and just translate that onto, whether we talked about Trump, onto some sort of, whether it's literally a Messiah figure or a leader, which I think is one of the things that this film and the Monty Python guys are critiquing is, and they literally say it word for word, you've got to make up your own mind. Think for yourself, be an individual. And I think that, to claim that it's a film that is directly attacking the Christian faith, I think is actually a deeply rooted in gospel message of don't just like join the crowd. This is about a personal relationship with Christ and actually coming to it as an individual and having your own understanding is actually really important, because if you just do what the crowd are doing, you'll be led astray.
And a call to being countercultural and swimming against the tide, and doing that at great personal cost, paid for mostly by most of the close disciples in the years that followed. And I guess, I mean, I haven't seen the Dune film, but just unpacking what you said. So instead of staying reluctant like Brian does, this guy knowingly grabs hold of his false messiahship that's been granted to him by others for his own political. And it's Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, was famously unhappy with how people received the first novel because people had misinterpreted it as a story about like a Luke Skywalker or a later something like a Harry Potter, like it's a hero story. And he was really unhappy with the fact that people had misinterpreted it as that. So the sequel, Dune Messiah, really doubles down on this idea that no, Paul becomes the anti-hero, becomes almost the villain because he leans into and claims this false messiahhood. And it's a really interesting. I'm later on in the book series at the moment, and that continues to be a theme. And I would encourage people to read the novel as a really, really, really complex, and it's like an 800-page novel, so it takes its time in establishing some of these things. Really complex dissection of the idea of Messiah. And similar to Life of Brian, I don't think it's a direct. Like I've heard what I perceive to be kind of ill thought out Christian critique of Dune as being antithetical to the gospel, which I think kind of
is making a binary that shouldn't have to be a binary, or clearly isn't a binary, that it's actually about false messiahs and the way that the concept of messiah has been weaponized and used to control crowds and culture.
Which we've seen now and in the last 100 years of history.
Yeah.
That's fresh history. More besides that, obviously.
Yeah.
So I listen to a podcast called The Rest is History, and they have recently done a 7-part series on the rise of Hitler. And not being a history student, I found it fascinating. They weren't talking about parallels with contemporary events, but they were plainly drawn or easy to draw out from the way, to get the message out, the Nazis invented and built cheap radios so there could be a radio in every house so they could get their message out. Now, you don't have to do that now to get your message out. So that was just a little slither of it. So I thought that was I learned a lot from it as a person who's not a historian or been particularly well read in history. About that, yes, a great kind of discussion about that particular thing and kind of what happened in the 30s. Like, it wasn't about the war; it was about what happened in the 30s in Germany.
I'd be curious now to kind of maybe talk a little bit about, we talked about this briefly at the beginning, and in conjunction with this TV debate that I mentioned. The idea of the intersection between faith and Christianity and comedy. This is a film that's openly using Christian iconography and swimming in spaces of religion. Like, it's not at all trying to hide it.
Yeah.
Understandably so, people were very upset by the closing musical number.
Trivializing crucifixion.
For people that haven't seen this film, it's essentially an earworm of a musical number with the people being crucified, singing along and whistling, and always look on the bright side of life is the name of the song. And so I guess, I don't know, I'm curious to interrogate this idea of, we mentioned before, like, is this movie, does it have the power to turn people away from faith or to bring them towards faith? Is, for people of faith, is a film like this that's making fun of or poking fun at, would probably be a better way of describing it, core images of faith, is that a dangerous thing for people of faith? Or is what my thought is possibly, and this might be a bit hardline for some people, is if your faith is able to be shaken by a film, your faith probably needs a bit of work anyway. I don't know. How do you feel about that in general?
Yeah, look, I think if it does make you think about what's important and why, and that struggle is a productive struggle, then I think that's an okay thing. Life of Brian is about foundational narrative of the gospel and the life of Jesus. But, what about Mr. Bean in church singing a hymn that he doesn't
know the words?
Right. Yeah. Again, amazing physical and physical comedy. Now, what does the Mr. Bean thing do? Well, it affirms to people that going to church is, if their perception is that going to church is stuffy and boring, then it's going to double down on that for them. for a Christian, well, it's either just plain funny because it's pretty close to the bone, or it just goes, well, so how do we gather as community and worship? How do we make that meaningful? Doesn't mean we have to change. Doesn't mean that seeing a Mr. Bean sketch is going to make you change how you run a worship service, but it might make you kind of just go, is this the right thing to be doing?
And is this really the perception?
And is it really the perception?
And what do we do about that?
In which case, you might then think about doing something about it. So, I mean, comedy is such a tricky thing about, and I think in this time where the line is between comedy that's okay and where what's a bit off. I don't know. It seems to be moving. People seem to think that it's moving. People seem to think that there was stuff that has been made in the past that you couldn't do now. Is that a good thing or not? And that's kind of opening up the conversation about jokes about race, gender, religion, like a broader conversation than what we're having about this particular film. And I don't know, I'd certainly kind of go, well, we just can't get too down on poking into things to make people think is a good thing. But, when's a joker just a little bit too off?
Hello, it is me, Pastor Jonty, coming to you from the set of Filthy Hope, interrupting this episode just briefly to tell you a little bit about one of our new ventures here at Filthy Hope, which is our blog. If you're a fan or a listener of what we do here at Filthy Hope, then you might enjoy getting more of that in the written form. So whether it be reflections on some of the topics that we talk about on the podcast, or just other topics that we are interested in at the moment, whether they be theological, religious, cultural, maybe about a film or a book. Ness and I are going to be writing some pieces and also some guest writers over there. So if that sounds like it is up your alley, then go and find it at unitingheartandsoul.org/filthy-hope. The link for that will be down below in the show notes of this episode. We hope to see you there and we hope you enjoy it. But that's all. Back to the episode.
Yeah, so there was this English comedy in the 70s, Love Thy Neighbour, and I'm reminded of it by something that had come up on Facebook or something. It must be an anniversary or something. And it was about a black and a white family living next door to each other in working class, lower middle class England. And the white guy was a racist and it was funny, but who was it making? Even my memory of watching it as a teenager was that it was making fun of the white guy who was a racist. Right. But nonetheless, I doubt that making jokes about nignogs was one of the catchphrases of the show would get made now. Be nice to think that the stereotype of what was being lampooned in the show didn't exist anymore.
It's an interesting thing to bring up, especially in regards to the life of Brian, because there's probably a couple, from today's cultural perspective, there's a couple of pieces of comedy in there that you kind of go, you could ask the question, could this get made today? Yeah. Is it not sensitive enough to some of the things that we're more sensitive to today? For example, there's a I think really well written bit about one of the members of the People's Front of Judea, or the
Judean People's Front. I can't remember which is which.
Who wants to be called Loretta? They're a woman now. And on the surface, you could say that's not a very sensitive bit of comedy in regards to how it's talking about the trans community. But I actually think, and we were talking off camera, that if you actually take a look at it as a piece of writing, it actually is providing. There are characters on both sides of that particular issue
some sense, one sense responding sensitively, if a little weirdly, and one just kind of going, well, how are you going to do that? You know, like
exactly. Yeah, and I think it's famously the famous phrase that people use all the time is that comedy ages like milk, because even aside from the cultural and the sensitivity side of it, things that are funny now, it's like how often do you watch? I mean, I do sometimes, but generally, how often do people watch comedy specials from 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago? Some of them are still funny, but largely comedy is funny in the present moment. Aside from any cultural or moral sensitivities that change constantly as culture moves on and develops.
Yeah, and this raises another thing about comedy, about and art, about the integrity of the artist.
Yeah.
You know, when I was a kid, you know, one of friends that we used to go and have holidays with had a bunch of Bill Cosby records of comedy routines.
Records. Yeah. Live albums.
And it's kind of on my list of things to do, to go back and listen to them. As a reflection of that, you know, what I found funny as a kid, and what was funny in the 70s. And then there's this other overlay obviously of what's happened with what we now know about him and his behaviour. So that, you know, that's just another kind of dimension to comedy dating, and like, you know, it might, like, I don't think it's a helpful thing to say the greatest comedy won't date, because great comedy that is putting the finger on the pulse of right now and therefore it ages in inverted commas. It doesn't mean it wasn't great, incisive, thought-provoking at the time it was delivered, or conceived and written, and you know, in many ways, and as I said before, I've been reading Cleese's autobiography, and I think a lot of the stuff that they'd worked on was very much of its time, like current affairs-y type stuff. And then there's other stuff like this where, while we've commented about a couple of gags, it is a timeless...
Yeah. I mean, the conversation we had
timeless
stuff about the crowds, like, is probably more relevant now than it was when this came out in the late 70s. Like, there's so many things that, while the granular level of the comedy itself might have aged in the wording or the performative elements of it, but like topically,
well,
so much of this is so relevant today.
Grievance culture. What have the Romans ever done for us? You know, like
that's the clip I used for in my presentation about Roman culture in Year 10 history. I was talking about all the great the things that the Romans developed that we use today, and as an illustration, I played the clip from this scene. Well, the aqueducts, medicine,
law,
running
and order.
Peace,
this. What were they complaining about? Now they were an occupied people and they were being oppressed.
Yeah.
But all of that other stuff, and like, having, as a quick aside, having recently been travelling in Europe and seen what was the highest structure that the Romans made, which was an aqueduct that took, I think, water travelled 50 kilometres and dropped 12 metres over that distance.
Yeah, wow.
To run, aside from the fact that the only reason they were draining water all over the place was to have enough water for their
baths,
self-indulgent baths, right?
Yeah.
As a sign of their wealth and superiority. And this thing took 20 years to build, to pump bath water to whatever town it was in southern France. Just amazing stuff. And, we see this grievance thing in the film. Now, they are being occupied and the film's kind of making fun of being aggrieved, and it's tricky because they were an occupied force, but
they did also
the Roman
provide a lot of benefit, just in terms of technological advancement.
correct
and
everyday life.
peace is the punchline at the end of
That's
that.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is complicated, because in first century Jerusalem, I suspect that the Hebrew people were looking for the Messiah to free them from the Romans.
Yeah.
And that's in,
This is what we spoke about in the last episode we did
about
Judas.
yeah.
Is one reading of his character is that he was just desperate and fired up about finding a leader to free them from Roman occupation. I think that I want to shout out. There's a comic that I love who's also a Christian, Pete Holmes, who people may know from his recent Netflix special. Came out, I think, this year, if not late last year. And there's a clip from a podcast that I really like that I might link down below. That's basically him on another podcast reflecting on what it means to be a Christian in comedy, and this idea that to be a follower of Jesus can sometimes lead people to live very sheltered, that in the world, not of the world idea of shutting off everything else that can be perceived as not of God.
Yeah.
And that in his world leans over into the world of comedy. And I think he makes the really persuasive point that if you look at the life and mission of Jesus, it wasn't about siloing off followers into their own little world. It was about going out into the world and living life to the full.
As was what happened with him coming to live amongst us,
Yes,
and
that's
his
right.
example for us, not to be comfortable, but
Yes.
to what's the right word? A ministry of presence, of being there,
Yeah.
not for the nice, clean people, but for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is a really he makes it a much clearer, more concise point in the clip that I'll have linked down below. But especially in regards to a film like this, going back to that TV debate, both arguments on both sides have flaws. It's a nuanced, interesting conversation to listen to. But the argument from the side of the clergy that it's blasphemous and it's harmful and it's dangerous, and not only should no one watch it, but they keep going on the fact that it's just not funny, which is also hilarious. Because you can tell they want to say that it's funny, but they're like, no, it's not funny. It's not funny. But this, even if it does make you uncomfortable, which of course it will probably push some buttons for followers if they haven't already seen this film. I think part of my understanding of the gospel and being a follower is, and it's a fine line, it's probably a whole podcast episode in nutting this out, but in not siloing off from the rest of the world. And earnestly and not passively, but actively engaging in ththings like this.
And what does holiness mean in that context? Yeah. And it would be. I mean, it's interesting to reflect on comedians that are Christian comedians who are doing good stuff. I used to read a lot of Adrian Plass, so very much a humorist, perhaps within the Christian community, and just some amazing, hysterical stuff that he wrote. And there's another English guy, Milton Jones. So I've got a couple of books, 10-second sermons, and they're kind of, he's written little hooky gags because his thing is one-liners.
Yeah. People might know him from Mock the Week.
And weird one-liners with weird juxtapositions of things. And, if you kind of don't notice or aren't paying attention to him on Mock the Week or whatever, but then you'd go, yeah, there was no sweary bits and there was no smutty jokes in that routine because that's not his thing. It's not his comedic character. But I'm sure that he would go, yeah, I just don't. Why would I do those gags? Quite often because that's the cheap way of getting a gag compared to actually writing something that's really well crafted and funny.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an interesting potential
It's actually just
conversation.
reminded me of another. There's a comedian whose name is Jamie Kilstein, who I don't find, he's not my cup of tea, but he now is part of his public identity now is as a new follower of Jesus. He's kind of has a history of being a very outspoken atheist, left-wing comic, and would go on like podcasts like Joe Rogan and be very outspoken about both his atheism and his strong left-wing political stances, and has now kind of done this 180 and is now a Christian. And he's actually got a podcast on the B-Side Network, which is for people that might know, The Basement with Tim Ross. He is in that kind of collective of content creators called The Back Row. So if people want to hear more about this, not from me, from him, I would suggest go and do that, and I'll put a link down below. But he's wrestling with this whole that thing of like, he's an established comic that wasn't a Christian for probably, I think, like 15 years of his career. So he has all this like built up identity of being this comedian.
All this material.
YouTube. But also in performing live, he has all this material that he knows works, is funny. People find hilarious because he has a career performing it. But as a Christian, he now has these convictions around whether it's swearing or some of the smutty stuff in his material. And it's super fascinating to hear him talk about it. And last I heard, he still hadn't found his new stance on it, which I think was really...
It's very transparent to be talking about that.
To be so open about that publicly and going, well, as a Christian, I now have these convictions around some of the content, but as a comic, I want to be true to my art form and as an artist, how do I mesh those two together? And at the time, last I heard him talking about on the podcast, he was committing to still doing those pieces of material as a way of bringing the gospel into those places, the dark comedy clubs.
Otherwise, he won't get the gigs.
Otherwise, he won't get the gigs. But also, how else is the gospel going to reach those places? Is kind of one of the things. Which is really interesting. And I'd be curious to go back and listen to more of his stuff and see how that has developed. Because that's to have that much transparency in that process.
Well, and to be opening yourself up to critique or rejection by your fans, pile-on culture applies to Christians who might express views that are unpopular just as much as someone who makes some kind of misstep. If everyone decides to pile on, it's not based on the merit of the argument or just whatever. It's like a footy player who gives an interview and lets rip with a bit of choice language.
30 seconds after the game's finished.
30 seconds after the game's finished. And you just go, I don't need to listen to a footy player dropping F-bombs on the air, but what else is going to happen if you're shoving a microphone in front of a 28-year-old or
front rower that's just been pummeled for 80 minutes?
As someone who happens to be a First Nations person who and people like to, let's be frank, like to pile onto him because of that at every opportunity out of racism. But then should he be, is he a role model? Should he be dropping F-bomb? How much media training can you bring to bear when you've just been playing footy for 80 minutes and someone shoves a microphone? And something, this might be a good place to wrap up, is something you mentioned beforehand that I wonder if is related, and if you had anything else to say about it, is being, should you be or can you be, or is it healthy, short answer no, to be offended by other people's blasphemy? Was that the phrase you used? Yeah. And even when I said that, I'm still thinking about that. Like, I guess it's up to God to be offended by someone else's blasphemy. I guess I'd be uncomfortable about it. I'd be sad about it, but offended about it,
It's an interesting.
I don't know. Even since when I said it before when we were talking, I kind of going, being offended by someone else's blasphemy. I don't know that it's my job to be offended by that. And
there are many other responses you could have that aren't. That's offensive.
And well, and you know, is the response about is engaging with someone who feels like they need to say something that we would say is blasphemous, is telling them that they've offended me in any way going to bring them to a point of understanding even that what they said was blasphemous, because half the time they probably wouldn't even know that it was. And I'm not sure how to respond to that, but I think banging on about my right not to be offended is not a great way of starting that conversation.
I just think it shuts down communication from the get-go. Would be my initial rating on that.
And that's not the same as saying, I don't care what anyone says. Because I probably do care. But taking offence and vocalising that I've been offended, I don't think that's a driver of change or of opening up conversation.
Yep. So people that are watching online will have seen that the camera just shut off, which probably is a signal that it's time for us to pull this boat in. I guess if people do have thoughts or comments or further things they want to talk about this movie, Life of Brian, but also with some of the broader topics that we've talked about today, because they're really interesting, and I feel like we've kind of just broken into a whole other topic.
A whole bunch of stuff,
which we might revisit on another occasion. As always, filthyhopepod@gmail.com is the email address that you can reach us at, or on social media. Just search for Filthy Hope. You'll find us. Or there's a link to our Facebook group down below, which is a really, really cool, rapidly growing group of people that just love the show, and we like to hang out and share some stories and check in with each other and just do community there. So if that sounds interesting to you, the link for that is down below. We would love to see you there. That just about does us. Are there any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
All,
yeah, great.
It's all good. And if you haven't seen Life of Brian...
you got to see it. You got to see it. Maybe you mentioned last time we did a podcast, we could do a Filthy Hope screening of Jesus in Montreal. This would be a brilliant...
We could almost do a film festival.
Yeah.
Filthy Hope Film Festival.
Yeah.
I'm sure there'd be some rights issues to sort out, but, they'd be sort-outable.
Yeah. We'll see. Actually, if you want to keep an eye on that, and if that does become a reality, join the Facebook group. That's probably where that will happen. That just about does us. Thank you for joining me.
Pleasure.
We've done 2 now. We've got to do a third. We've got to round out the trilogy. Thanks for listening. We will see you guys next time.
This is a prayer for the people who want to give up, who have been hurt beyond repair and cannot bear to see your face in anything. Find peace in letting go of the guilt that isn't yours, and find hope in understanding. Life is not a game you have to win. Forgiveness overwhelming, salvation not deserving. You are loved by something beyond, someone beyond understanding. Drink deep and taste the fullness of life in community.